Hello, this is Gonzalo Lira speaking to you live, and this is the roundtable number 22. And I am joined by I'm not kidding when I say some of my favorite people, just don't tell them, okay? I'm joined by Alex Christoforou of the Duran. Alex, my friend, how's it going? Good to see you.
Hello, Gonzalo.
I'm joined by the estimable Larry Johnson. How are you, sir?
Fat, dumb, and happy.
Yeah, and well, I'm kind of like the same, to tell you the truth. Today has been a very good day, and I'll tell you about it later. And from Thailand, we're joined by the New Atlas's Brian Berletic. Brian, how's it going?
It's a pleasure and an honor to be on yet another roundtable. Thank you, Gonzalo.
Oh man, you say that it's an honor, man. You hang out with the wrong crowd. I'm telling you that right now. Alex, I'm going to throw it to you because Alex unfortunately has to run after an hour, so we're going to squeeze the most out of him that we possibly can in this time. Alex, what has happened? What is going on? Is the end of the world as we know it about to happen?
Gosh, maybe. You know, I have to honestly answer that question. Perhaps we have to see what is the collective West going to do? What is NATO going to do?
Okay, so to recap, what happened was that the Putin announced there was going to be a partial mobilization. He called up 300,000 reservists, which I'm assuming is going to take a while to train them. So it's really a way to reorganize his forces and put more people in Ukraine. And the West has had a complete freak out over this because Putin mentioned about nuclear blackmail insofar as shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And he intimated, if you will, because I saw the entire speech, which seemed very measured and very calm and collected. And he intimated that, if any Western power has any nuclear ideas, that they best keep those ideas to themselves because Russia has the means to do something about it. And so from there, what has been the West's reaction?
Well, they really are jumping on the statement that Putin made with regards to nuclear weapons. I mean, they've focused the narrative on that particular line, even though he said a lot of things during that 14-minute address, as did Shoigu, which the collective West is just, it seems like they're completely ignoring all of that stuff, and they're focusing in on the statement with regards to nuclear weapons. Okay, I understand it. They can play around with that narrative. They can package it, and they could throw it out there to paint the picture that Putin is once again this madman who wants to destroy the world, and he's capable of anything. And he's now painted it to a corner. I think the New York Times had an article with the title something like "Painted it to a corner." Putin, could do anything. So I think that's the overarching narrative. The interesting thing about the nuclear statement, Gonzalo, is that the collective West seems to have amnesia with regards to nuclear threats. I remember Zelensky in the Munich Security Conference about a week and a half before the special military operation got underway, and he was running around Munich along with Kamala Harris and Ursula von der Crazy and Olaf Scholz and Annalena Baerbock. All of them were there. And what was Zelensky saying? I'm going to get nukes. I'm going to get nukes. I'm telling you all, they're giving me nukes. No one said anything.
Yeah.
No one told Zelensky to shut up. No one told him, hey, man, quiet down. No one called a press conference and said, you know what? This guy is crazy. There's no way. As the United States of America, as the vice president of the U.S., I'm telling you right now, there is no way that this guy is going to get nuclear weapons. None of that stuff's going to happen. Forget about it. Nope. They encouraged him.
Yeah.
They said, yeah, keep on going. And ever since that statement, we've had multiple EU and NATO officials, come out with statements calling for the nuclear destruction of Russia. From France, I remember doing a video about 2 months ago where there was a Polish official and a French official both said that Moscow needs to be dealt with via nuclear weapons. There's been various EU officials. There is a whole list of collectivist officials calling for the use of nuclear weapons against Russia. I mean, specifically calling for nuclear weapons. So anyway, we forget about everything they've said. We focus in on what Putin said, and they're running with that.
Yeah.
He said so many more interesting things that Brian and Larry can get into. in that 14-minute speech, as well as what Shoigu said during his interview that is really worth discussing, because we got a lot of information.
I didn't hear Shoigu's statement, unfortunately. I was pressed for time. What did you say specifically?
I don't know if Brian or Larry wants to handle it, but he talked about the casualties. He talked about the, the mobilization. He talked about a lot of things. Yeah.
Let's toss it to Brian. Brian, what did Shoigu say, if you don't mind my asking you?
Well, it's interesting because Russia has been kind of tight-lipped about casualties, especially their own casualties, for the longest time. Then they came up with this number, which is around 6,000 Russian soldiers dead, not counting the local militias. And this number seems very reasonable. They also gave a number regarding Ukrainian dead soldiers, and that was around, I think it was like 61,000. Yeah. And again, that is actually a very reasonable number, with another, I think it was like 49,000 injured. And I'm assuming this means serious injuries, people that are not coming back. Yeah. So this is like 100,000 out of a mobilized force of 300,000. That is like a third of what Ukraine put together for this conflict. And now that's gone. That is after Russia did this special military operation. Now they're going to follow on with a mobilization of 300,000 Russian soldiers, send them into Ukraine. What do people imagine is going to happen? And I think what Alex is kind of talking about, and things that we've all probably seen looking at the headlines, I think there's a general panic across the West. They're saying Putin is panicking, but I think this is actually projection. This is the West looking at their emptied inventories, looking at where Ukraine has ended on the map with their massive offensive that they spent months preparing for. They're looking at all of that, and now they've got 300,000 Russian soldiers coming. Yes, it's going to take time to train them up and move them to wherever they're going to go. Maybe some of them aren't even going to go into Ukraine. But this is obviously Russia expanding the scope and moving beyond the special military operation, which means there are other things they can do between now and the time these reserves show up. There's plenty they can do in between that with forces that are already around and ready. Because, like I said, the special military operation, I don't know if they've officially ended it and transformed this into something else, but it's very clear the way it's going to unfold is it's not going to be a special military operation anymore. The referendums, this is already a done deal. I mean, they're going to get these regions, and it's going to be considered Russian territory, and they're going to be fighting from this point onward as if Ukraine is attempting to move into Russian territory. So it's a huge shift. A lot of people they're saying that this is Putin panicking, but we've seen this incremental operation that Russia has launched unfold over now 7 months. People like Scott Ritter have been saying for months that Russia didn't have anywhere near enough troops to accomplish the objectives we all think that Russia has, like Odessa, Kharkov, taking Kharkov back. But now they're going to have enough. They're going to be having these reserves come in. They will have enough troops to do this. So this is like filling in the question marks that we all had about where this operation is heading, how they're actually going to achieve all of these objectives. Now I think these blank spaces are being filled in with this mobilization.
Yeah, Larry, do you think that Putin is panicking? Because he did not look like a man who was in a panic, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, well, I put up on my blog yesterday that scene from the Lord of the Rings trilogy where Denethor runs out to the edge of the balcony, the wall overlooking the city, screaming, "Flee, flee, run!" And I posted that as video from inside the Kremlin of Putin reacting. It was designed to ridicule this attitude of the West. I frankly I can't even wrap my mind around the disconnect between reality that is evident among all of the Western leaders, from obviously the demented Joe Biden, but the rest of the European leaders. They have convinced themselves, and I mean genuinely convinced themselves, boy, Russia is getting beaten and beaten bad. There is great unrest within the Kremlin, within the political circles in Russia. That Putin is on the ropes. That he's not going to last. Maybe he's got a day or two, and it is they are not making this up. They really believe it, and that is dangerous, because when you divorce yourself from reality and fail to appreciate the kind of resources that Russia has at its disposal. I've got a buddy, retired military, keeps sending me all this stuff. Yeah. Did you know that they're gonna run out of, they don't have the ability to make their own weapons. I mean, they're running out. And it's like, yeah. I go, dude, I said, remember, we, the United States, we're having to buy rocket engines from them. They make rocket engines. We can't. We're supposedly the great industrial power, and we're having to go hat in hand to the Russians on that. They make their own ammunition. They make their own pistols. They make their own rifles, and they're very good rifles. They make tanks. I mean, just go up the list. This notion that oh boy, they're cut off. I want to go back. Shoigu said one other thing that, hopefully the West paid attention to. He talked about targeting satellites. That hasn't come up before. Once you cross, and the thing I saw about Putin was, you're right, he was calm, but his body language was this. He was leaning forward, and he was dead ass serious about what he was saying. That Russia is not playing. And he said it very specifically. I am not bluffing. And the West is going, sure he is. Sure, they've watched too many poker tournaments on television. They're convinced that Putin is some sort of poor poker player. But he made it very clear that Russia will do what is necessary to defend against Russia, and to defend against the attack on Russia by NATO. And now the discussion, it used to be that not even admitting the proxy war. Now it's a flat out fact. We're at war. We're at war with Russia. That's what people in the West are saying. And it's like, you people don't, as Andrei Martyanov is fond of saying, these people don't know what war is. No, we spent too much time beating up on little brown people around the world that couldn't fight back, that we've gotten accustomed to, having our way. And the reality is now, as I say, the chicken's coming home to roost.
Yeah, the first foreign freedom fighters, the first foreign mercenaries, basically, who showed up, who thought that they had this weird notion that it was going to be like the Spanish Civil War, that this foreign legion would come in and they'd be decisive in this battle. And they got one taste of Russian artillery and they went screaming. So and the notion too, what you said, Larry, of the irreality of the leadership class, of them, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Union, actually claiming in a thought-through speech that the Russians are taking out microchips from washing machines to put them into their aircraft or something. And I'm like, what drug are you taking? Because I want some of it. It must be very good.
But that is what they're being told. I learned this last week from a couple of different sources. The United States intelligence community, its intelligence estimates, what it's writing, they're taking what the Ukrainians are telling us, repackaging and putting that out. Now, back in the day, we would get information from, that's called liaison sources. So you get it from liaison, you would double check it. There are ways to check, for example, using overhead imagery, using signal intercepts, a whole variety of ways you could try it. They're not double checking. They are taking literally what the Ukrainians are the Ukrainians are saying, yeah, man, we blew up 4 Russian generals last night. Putting it out, they're saying, yeah, well, Russia is on the ropes because they've lost 4 of their main generals.
Well, there's that saying in journalism that sometimes the story is too good to be checked. They want it to be true, and they're feeding into themselves this nonsense. And so if they're basically declaring war on Russia and they're going to go to war with Russia, they're going to find out that they're going to find out how misguided they actually are, but to the detriment of tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps more. Alex? What are your thoughts on this whole thing?
Well, we had the same thing happen in 2015 during the after the Maidan. The narrative that the collective West was getting, the information that they were getting, admittedly so, they said it, they were getting all the information from the Ukraine side of things, not from Donbass. And who was pulling the strings behind, back then, who was pulling the strings behind the Ukraine side of things? It was the State Department. It was Nuland. It was all these people who were orchestrating everything that was happening in 2014, 2015. So I think it's a really interesting dynamic where you have the Ukraine Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Communications, the Zelensky government. They're feeding all the narratives to the collective West. And you know that the main puppeteers of this conflict, the main sponsors of this conflict, are a lot of the neocons and the Clintonites who are embedded in the Department of State, the Newlands, the Institute for the Study of War, all of these people, and it's kind of like this circular information flow in a way. And we're seeing the same exact thing this time around as well. All the media, everybody is getting their main talking points from one side of this conflict, and no one is even bothering to listen to what the Russians are saying. Not even when you have the president and the Minister of Defense on TV telling everybody, crystal clear, Shoigu said it, crystal clear. We were at war with Ukraine. We did have a special military operation with Ukraine. We destroyed their military. We destroyed all their weapons. But now we're at war with NATO. We are at war with the West. And as Larry said, he was very specific with the satellites. I don't know, Larry said there's 70 satellites. There's X many, surveillance systems. Here are the numbers. Here they are. We know everything that's going on. And, I think about what happened in 2015 after the Maidan. I think about everything today. And I just say to myself, I wish that Ukraine would just stop listening to all of these people and just sit down with Russia and solve this. Because if you take a step back and you realize where Ukraine was back in 2014-15, when that conflict ended in 2015 and they had the Minsk Accords, they had the recognition of Crimea, and then they would have had their country whole. Neutral, but whole. And that includes Lugansk and Donetsk as autonomous republics, but a country that is whole, that recognizes the Russian language, recognizes the Russian culture. Nothing wrong with that. In Cyprus, we have 3 official languages, so there's nothing wrong with that. But look where they are today. They traded the recognition of Crimea, and today they've lost 4 additional regions plus Crimea, and it looks like they're about to lose more.
Yeah, I mean, Brian, like even Poland is starting to talk about wanting a chunk of Ukraine. And the former Romanian foreign minister was talking about essentially the dismemberment of what remains of Ukraine.
Yeah. And again, this is something that people have to keep in mind when you're talking about the West being your ally. They don't have any allies. They have nations that they are using. They are going to use... Yeah. They're going to be using these nations until there's nothing at all left. They are using Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia. They clearly have no interest at all in Ukraine's future. There is no future for Ukraine under this plan that the West has them plodding along on. It's the exact same thing for Taiwan. They're saying, "Oh yeah, we're gonna come in and defend Taiwan." No, they're not. They're just using it as an excuse to fight another one of their adversaries on the global stage. It is the exact same playbook over and over again. And you could try to name me one nation that the U.S. has swooped in aid of that has turned out for the better. There isn't a single one. Look at Libya. Look at Libya, how that has turned out. Look at all of those countries during the so-called Arab Spring that the U.S. was orchestrating these movements, and they've all suffered significantly Some of them, like say Egypt, they're counting themselves lucky because it wasn't as bad as Libya. But this is what the West does to their allies. This is what's going on with Ukraine. There is no off ramp for them. I think Alex said it best. Look back at 2015, and now look at where they are now. They are never going back to that period. It's over. And as I've often said, that every single day this goes on, Ukraine is going to lose more of their territory, more of their people. These are things that they are never, ever going to get back. The idea that there's members in the EU, like on the fence post waiting to snatch up some territory from Ukraine. I mean, I don't know if that's actually going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised because they're not Ukraine's allies. They're using Ukraine to do something they themselves don't want to do. And that this is the result. This is how it's going to unfold. This is very unfortunate.
Yeah, because like there are lots of pieces of Ukraine that different countries covet for various reasons, historical reasons, historically grounded reasons. Lviv is an important city in the Polish historical imagination, and Transnistria is a historical part of Hungary. And other pieces of it to Romania as well. And there's also the issue that's coming up of Belarus. Who's been following that? Because it sounds like Belarus is making moves. And I've been reading this somewhere, and I don't know how accurate this is, the notion that perhaps there will be a second front in Ukraine coming out of Belarus. How credible are these reports? Do either of you know?
Well, no, I think it's very credible from the standpoint that once none of this is going to take place until after the referenda are completed. So after all four now new republics of Russia take the vote, and then the Duma blesses that, brings them in, they're officially part of Russia. Then at that point, any attack on those provinces, on those new republics, will be a casus belli, and Russia then can activate the CSTO agreements, and that puts Belarus right into play. So all of a sudden, you're not looking at just Russian forces; you're looking at Belarusian forces coming from the north, and Kiev and NATO. Then they got big problems. They can't handle. They talk tough, but what are they going to do? They don't have an army on the ground that's capable of entering the fray and moving forward.
Wait, Larry, hanging. I got it from authority, from Jens Stoltenberg himself, who said that a massive NATO army was amassing on the western borders of Belarus and Ukraine.
Yeah, the boy has a rich fantasy life. It's just because you may even have some people sitting on bases, but then you get to that more fundamental issue: how are you going to move them from point A to point B, and where's your logistics line? The air reliance on air power. What people have failed to grasp. We're in a new era. This is like the period 1937 to 1940, because if you recall, the United States still had an active cavalry unit. I mean, we're talking guys on horses riding around with guns, shooting people, thinking that was part of their military planning. Well, candidly, that's where we are now with fixed wing aircraft piloted by men or women. They are an anachronism. They've been made an anachronism because of the combination of the air defense systems that have been developed, and Russia has the most robust air defense systems in the world. Couple that with the fact that drones do a lot of what these jet fighters used to do, and without having to worry about losing a pilot and then trying to send out a combat search and rescue operation to recover a downed pilot. So just, we're going to see the transition away from this, and the transition will come in the result of some of these NATO aircraft getting shot down if they dare to venture into Ukrainian territory with the intent of backing up Ukraine. So I think that this is, getting the Belarusians involved is something I think highly likely, not unlikely.
Because it would seem to me that from the north, they could make a stab towards Kiev. And even if they don't actually do anything, just as the Russians really didn't try to take Kiev in any kind of meaningful sense, they can wreak havoc on the remaining Ukrainian forces and completely just scramble them, so that the Russians in the south have a much freer hand to do whatever they want, specifically Odessa, I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Alex?
No, it
Oh,
diverts
sorry,
the
Larry.
forces. No, go ahead, Alex.
No, I mean, absolutely. I don't know. What were you going to say, Larry?
No, I was just going to say, I absolutely agree with that. It opens up another front. This will be the essence of Ukraine having to fight a two-front war, because they have to worry about east and south, and now they have to worry about north, and they don't have the forces to do that. It's just a flat out manpower logistics issue, and they don't have the weaponry to do it.
Yeah, because I mean, you basically said that. Alex, sorry.
No, isn't it interesting that over the past couple of months, it's been the NATO and the collective West, which has been trying to find a second front to distract and occupy Russia, and we don't know if this is going to happen, but they may actually be the ones that are now going to have to face a second front if this does play out. This scenario, if it does come true. But here's a scenario that's definitely going to come about, I believe. Zaporozhye is going to be voting as a region, as a whole.
Yeah.
There's a part of Zaporozhye which is under Ukraine control. They're going to be considered occupiers once they vote to enter the Russian Federation.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think of these referendums, if the Ukrainians start shelling the voting areas, which I would not put it past them, this would be even more outrageous. And of course, the West isn't going to say a thing about it. It's really despicable. But I want to turn to Brian. What do you think of the military possibilities into the future? I mean, this notion of a northern front, and frankly, let's talk about it. The possibility of NATO getting into this fray directly with troops on the ground, aircraft in the sky. What do you think of that?
I think Larry said it perfectly. Whether Belarus gets involved or not, that there is this force there that is a constant potential threat for Ukrainian forces that they have to constantly add into their calculations. Maybe Belarus doesn't even need to get directly involved. Maybe they just need to do, a small incident just to remind Ukraine that they're there, just to complicate their disposition of forces. As far as NATO getting involved, I mean, they keep saying we're not fighting Russia, because they are fighting Russia. Every time they have to constantly make a point, it's because it's true, and they don't want you to understand that it's true. So they already are fighting Russia. They have emptied their inventories. There really is nothing more of practical use that they can send. They can send a little bit more of this or that, but we keep hearing Kiev trying to pressure, say, Germany to send Leopard 2 tanks. I've talked about this many times. It could take 6 months to train an entry-level tank crew. The Leopard 2 has 4 crew members instead of 3 on a Soviet-era tank, because they got autoloaders. Leopard 2 does not, so you have to train a role that doesn't even exist in Ukraine's existing tank force. And it will take months, if not years, to integrate that. Plus, you have to talk about sustaining these Leopard 2s on the battlefield. And then you have to consider that Western main battle tanks are meant to go into battle as part of a combined arms force. That means they assume that they will have air superiority, which they don't and won't have in Ukraine. They're assuming that they will have artillery, rocket artillery in large numbers dominating the battlefield. They're not going to have that. So you're sending it into an environment it was never intended to be in, and it is not going to fare well. It's going to fare as well as all of Ukraine's other tanks, which are all gone, which is why they're begging Germany for Leopard 2s, however impractical it is. So the notion of NATO getting involved, they're going to face all the exact same problems Ukraine's military has faced. They're going to, as Larry said, he's not citing Russian sources. Western analysts acknowledge that Russia has the best air defense systems in the world. That is the West admitting that. This is a problem that they have acknowledged for years that they've been trying to rectify, and so far they haven't been able to. And sending these anti-radiation missiles, these
harm,
that's harm. This is an experiment. They had no ambition to actually solve the problem. This was just them saying, well, what if what would happen. And they claim that they're being they're highly effective, but again, just as Larry has said, they're just repeating what Ukraine has claimed. Ukraine is saying, yeah, they're working wonders on the battlefield, but okay, show me where this has worked wonders. I don't see it. So this is a problem for Ukraine. It'll be a problem for NATO forces if they decide to get involved more directly, because I would say already they're quite directly involved.
Oh yeah, there's no question that they're directly involved insofar as the supply of weapons. But I'm wondering what would be the escalation step that would really, because I mean, it seems to me, and I hate to put it in these terms, but it seems to be accurate in that the Western leadership are like children, right? And they always, more and more and more. They can't just sort of like have the patience or self-control to say, okay, let's stop here and sort of like have an assessment, right? They keep on escalating. And so in Alex's video today, he was talking about how they're going to do more sanctions, more weapons, right? But what's the definitive next step for NATO? I'm asking all three of you guys if you have a sense of what would be a real escalation. Because from my point of view, they already, to be vulgar about it, they shot their wad in February and March with all the sanctions and all the weapons. But what would be the next step for them? And I'm wondering about that because I want to be able to anticipate where this conflict might be going as to whether it will escalate or they'll just keep on throwing weapons and sanctions and eventually just peter out. I'm throwing it to all three of you. What do you all, any of you think? Larry?
I don't see how they're going to be able to sustain even supplying Ukraine as winter comes on and as the economic crisis in Europe, in particular, and the United States to a lesser degree, intensifies because people are already cold. I mean, Alexander McDurras apparently almost froze his ass off up in England for the weekend.
And by the way, Alex, send him our best. Yeah.
Yeah.
and he contracted bubonic plague in the process. So, but the reality of people being hungry and cold is going to intrude on this. So I think there is a belief that we can put, quote, more advanced weaponry into the hands of the Ukrainians. In theory, sounds great, because the reality is, up to this point, the United States has been emptying its closets of crap that was stored away and really wasn't being used. It wasn't frontline equipment. If they decide to go that route, great. But then you've got the problem, as Brian identified, training. You got to get these people trained to use it.
My thinking, Larry, has been that from the very get-go, these more sophisticated systems have been manned by actual NATO troops or NATO contractors of some sort. It doesn't seem possible that they could have taken these weapons and the Ukrainians automatically just started using them. And so
they've used contractors. I know that for certain. But even then, we're still not sending our best and brightest. Just like I know that one thing that the U.S. intelligence community has puzzled over from the outset is why Russia has not put all of its most technical systems on the battlefield, and why they haven't introduced their frontline troops. They're still scratching their heads trying to figure out what are they up to, without recognizing what they're up to, which is they're going to, right now, they're in this concept in the military of what's called being a supported commander vice supporting. And supported means you're in charge and you get to tell everybody else what to do to come help you. Whereas if you're supporting, you're one of those ones, if you get called, you got to come help. And the reality is the West has viewed this entire special military operation as the Russian operation with the Russians in charge, when in reality, they've dealt with the Donetsk and Luhansk militias as in a supporting role, not the supported role. And that is going to change now with the declaration. Once those provinces are republics in Russia, then they will become, Russia will take over as the supported commander. And it's going to be a new ballgame.
Yeah, because I mean, at this stage, my thinking is that the natural objective of the Russians at this point would be to get a hold of Odessa and break through at Kramatorsk and make a drive towards Dnipropetrovsk. What do you guys think of that? Because I mean, that seems to be like the logical next step, and to do it so in winter, which would be advantageous for the Russians and hell for the remaining Ukraine forces. Is that reasonable? What do you think, Brian?
I just want to kind of build on
Sure.
to how I think NATO is going to try to intervene. I've said this since the very beginning, using Syria as kind of a, as an example. They could try to enter into Ukraine, create some kind of buffer zone where they would do everything they could to avoid direct confrontation with Russian forces. And they could try to say, at least keep part of Western Ukraine, or even go into Odessa. I think they realize that Russia has ambitions toward Odessa, and they would love to preserve that so that whatever is left of Ukraine at the end of all of this has some sort of access to the sea. And so that's how I imagine they would try to do it. And I would not bet if I was in charge of NATO, I would not bet on Russia not responding to that. It's not like Syria, as many people have pointed out, especially in Russia. This is existential for Russia. This is not a war of choice. If people in the Western media pretend like it is, but if you've been paying attention to the Atlantic Council, they've been talking about absorbing Russia for decades. This is encircle, contain, divide, destroy, absorb Russia. This is all they've talked about, and this is all they've demonstratively done on the global stage for decades. And Russia is wise to it. And they know that that's what the stakes are now. Larry is absolutely correct about Russia being there to support the local militias. I want to kind of point attention to what just happened around Kherson. Around Kherson, it was heavily Russian forces involved. It was Russian defenses, I would say almost on a divisional level. And you saw how lopsided the fighting was in favor of Russia. Even the Washington Post was saying, Ukraine just got defeated on every imaginable level. Just imagine what that's going to be like if Russia set up the whole front like that, which is what they're doing. That's what they're doing right now. So I absolutely agree with Larry on that.
Oh, by the way, Big Basil in the chat says Brian is far too intelligent to be a CIA agent.
Yes, I don't know.
Well,
I don't know if that's a compliment or not.
In the current crop, yes, I would agree, because CIA used to be a hell of a lot more intelligent, and Larry, tell me otherwise. They used to be a hell of a lot smarter than they are now, because they seem to be just doing all kinds of foolishness. I mean, I don't. I grab my head at the stupidity and the arrogance and the endlessness of this conflict. But one of you guys help me out here, because I'm just like, I'm adrift in this whole conflict. Go ahead, Alex.
No. Well, I'll weigh in on the question that you posed, Gonzalo, and maybe this will answer your question as well. Why you're adrift, because I'm like you as well. I say this is crazy. These people are just too stupid to be in power. But maybe there's something to it. What could NATO do? I think NATO has cards to play. I'm not saying they're good cards, but I think they have a lot of cards to play. A second front, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Keep an eye out where Pelosi travels to. It seems that she's the new John McCain, and where she goes, regime change, color revolution follows. So there's the second front option. There's a real distinct possibility that they're going to try something in Kosovo, Metohija. A real distinct possibility. NATO is calling up reserves there. They've issued some threats already within the past week.
Where's this?
They said if in Kosovo with Serbia.
Oh, yeah.
So there is a very real possibility that they may try something there, and NATO is moving around in there as we speak. So that's something we need to really keep an eye out for. And the Serbian President Vučić has also issued statements the past couple of days saying things are getting very very dangerous. So focus
you're telling me
there.
that NATO is they can't beat up Russia, so they're going to beat up on Serbia?
Well, I'm saying in Kosovo there was already problems in August, and it looks like NATO is moving around pieces in there right now. And that's a possibility. There's the possibility of Poland moving into the West, which we've already talked about. There's also the possibility that no one's really talking about it, but there were some Senate hearings, some congressional hearings the other day, where they were talking about that 300 billion in Russian assets, foreign reserves, and assets that were seized. And they're trying to get legislation passed, which I'm sure they will, so that the U.S. government, the Treasury can and the Justice Department can make it so that all those assets could be pocketed. In other words, they're going to say they're going to send it to Ukraine. Okay, this money is going to be sent to Ukraine in order to rebuild Ukraine, but we all know what's really going to happen. So there's the possibility. I think there's a small chance, but still it's possible that, the collective West may say, you know what, and a lot of the people up top may say, this was a great gig while it was going on for the past 8-10 years. We had Burisma, we had Hunter, we had Devin Archer, and all these people, the Kerry kids, everyone. We all did really, really well. The military-industrial complex. Here's our $350 billion payday. All right, next conflict. Let's take a look at what's going on in Taiwan. Possible, but they want that money. They want that money, and it's a lot of money.
Yeah, as to whether it's actually 300 and some odd billion dollars, I'm not quite sure about that, because Russia itself is never.
You're talking about all the assets.
Yeah, but they're doing it well.
They were talking about everything they've seized.
Well, what the Germans have done, insofar as Gazprom's properties there, they've seized that property. So yeah, it's not beyond the realms of the possible that they start seizing these financial assets of the Russians. I actually don't think that the assets actually total up to 300 billion. I think that the Russian central bank in particular was a lot smarter than that, because they've never actually come out and confirmed that number. That's the number floating around, but there are certainly Russian assets, and it would just be part and parcel of the criminal, cronyistic kind of degenerates who are leading the West. I mean, I view them as degenerates.
Yeah.
Larry?
Well, no, I think it's not so much the amount of assets that's being seized. It is that it's the destruction of it's the destruction of the principle of property being protected. That in the West, the West was always viewed as sort of a safe haven for assets. That while there was chaos overseas, you could at least go into the United States and your money would be protected, your assets would be protected, because if nothing else, you had a judicial system that worked to protect the rights, and that it couldn't just be taken from you. That's not the trash.
Yeah.
I mean, the United States is like a drunken pirate just out there, hey, booty, and just grabbing it right and left and then running off with it. And
yes, you're exactly right.
That's what was sort of, I won't say amusing, but some of these Russian oligarchs who had been a bit of a thorn in Putin's side over the years and had been ingratiating themselves with a variety of Westerners, they thought, oh, well, we can always count on our buddies in the West because, they're lubricating them with a few dollars. Well, boom. All of a sudden, they're pariahs. And they go, wait a second, we're your friends. And the United States, we don't care, we're taking it. It's just that reality is part of this, I think, fundamental transformation we're seeing in the world right now. And we're not going to appreciate what has taken place until it's over. But I think this is as profound as what happened at the end of World War II with the breakup of the British and French colonial empires, the establishment of the United States as the preeminent international reserve currency. That set in place the ability of the United States to dominate for 60 years. That's over, baby. That's over.
Yeah, I completely agree. And also, is something that people don't seem to understand is that when they talk about money laundering countries, they always talk about Bermuda or Panama or whatever. The number one money laundering country in the world is the United States. People don't know this. And the people who put the most money into the United States in order to hide assets and move money around are precisely those countries that are geopolitical competitors of the United States. China, Russia, India, to a much lesser extent Iran, but there's some Iranian money floating around in the United States. And so these people no longer trust the United States. And so they are going to be pulling out their assets from American jurisdictions. And what happens, of course, is that these assets in American jurisdiction can be used, and are used, in fact, and quite normally, as part of the financial assets and management in the United States. And so these large countries, where a lot of people from these countries have parked a lot of assets in the United States, they're slowly going to be pulling them out. Because, what happens if my country is next? I don't want to be caught with my pants down, financially speaking. And so, this hurts the United States financially to an extraordinary extent. Now, Brian, I see you there. You have like some big ideas.
Not really, but I was listening to Alex's most recent video talking about sanctions and everything, and just how ridiculous. Like, what else are they going to throw at Russia? And then what to follow on to what Larry just said about how the entire global system is going to be changing, shifting.
I'm still here, just getting some coffee. I'm sorry, Brian.
Oh, no worries. So China is watching all of this. They're watching everything that the United States and the European Union, NATO, the collective West, these special interests that make up the West, they are watching what they're doing to Russia. And they're just thinking, well, we're obviously next. Obviously, we are next, and we need to be prepared for this. And I just thought it was, I don't know if it's funny or depressing, but you saw the Western media even trying to say, well, it looks like China is putting some distance between themselves and Russia. And nothing could be further from the truth. They fully understand that if this is an existential threat to Russia, it's just as much of a threat to China. They understand that just looking at their own history, that they were almost picked apart by these interests, and that these interests have unfinished business with China, and that they're going to do the exact same thing. And so the idea, China has to say this publicly, because they don't want to start eroding the fundamental non-interference principles that they try to adhere to. But they understand that these are extenuating circumstances, that the Donbas region, this wasn't like Russia in the background or organizing this, engineering this. This was in response to U.S. interference. They understand that. They have to publicly say that they're against intervention, because they've got their own problem with Taiwan, and actually a couple of other places the U.S. has been involved in for decades. But at the end of the day, they understand that they're in the same boat. And a lot of other countries are starting to look at what the U.S. and the EU are doing, seizing assets, and they're worried too. Just like Larry said, these were supposed to be safe havens. This was supposed to be a rock of stability in global affairs. And now they look like drunken pirates, and they're saying, let's bring everything home and think about an alternative. And the West is doing this to themselves. We talked about the last time we got together about the West is so obsessed with hegemony, pursuing it, and whether they can keep it or not, that they're not thinking about whether they should or not. And that this is the cost. This is the price that they're going to pay.
Yeah, because they've become enamored of their power, but they don't actually use the power to benefit their own citizenry. That's the thing that I find most despicable. Because, I've never been to China myself, but from what you, Brian, have said about China, and other people, Alex Mercouris, for instance, who've been to China, they say that it's a wonderful country. The infrastructure, everything is clean, organized, well-run. If the United States government, the regime, the Western regimes, were taking that kind of care insofar as their own people, well, then okay. But it seems that they're allowing their own countries to deteriorate to a point of no return for these military adventures, geopolitical adventures. And the thing is, my thinking is, as especially the European situation begins to deteriorate radically this winter. I mean, people credibly have said that, I think it was Viktor Orban who said that European industry would decline by 40%. Somebody threw around that number, somebody credible. I forget whom. I think it was Orban. It might have been somebody else. It doesn't really matter. It was somebody credible. And it actually seems a reasonable amount of industrial decline in Western Europe. It could give the political rationale to ramp up the West's response to the Ukraine situation and turn it into a full-fledged war, and blame all the economic problems on this war that was unjustified, and the Russians did it, and the Russians are evil, so we all have to sacrifice, like we did during the malady that we had a couple of years ago, where we all locked down and we all suffered equally. let's do that too, so that we can defeat the evil Russian Putin Putler bad guy. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I could see a scenario like that. At least them trying. But again, it comes down to the fundamentals of their industrial base having rotted to the extent that it has, and just the fact that in terms of military and economic power, there are alternatives now. They are not the only game in town. I think this is their fundamental problem. I think they painted themselves into a corner. I could be wrong, but that just seems like that.
That seems so to me. Alex, what do you think?
No, I think the European Union, they have essentially two options at this moment in time. The one option is to listen to Orban and to just stop this sanction stuff, end it. It's not going to provide the relief that Europe needs, but at least it's going to help a little bit. Just stop the sanctions. It's over. They're not going to do that. No, they're not going to do that. They're incapable of doing that.
No, they're going to ostracize Orban now.
Yeah, exactly. That's what they're doing. That's the one option. The other option is just to continue to escalate. And I believe that the European Union at this moment in time, they desperately want this war to continue at the rate that it was moving at. I don't think they want it to speed up. I don't think they want it to slow down. I think they liked it just the way it was, because they saw it as a long war, and they thought to themselves, as we deindustrialize and as everything goes to hell, we could just continue to blame it on Putin, and he is fighting the European Union, and Ukraine is protecting EU values, and they're the ones on the front line, so we got to support them, and everyone that's suffering in the European Union. This all has a meaning. This all has a purpose. It's all about protecting EU values, and it's about protecting Ukraine, who's fighting for those values. So we're going to have to suffer. We're not going to have heat. We're not going to have hot water. We're all going to get a lot poorer. But there's a reason for this, and that's because we have this long war in Ukraine, a long war. It's going to go till 2030.
Yeah, that's what they're starting to say.
Yeah, so let's, so I think the EU was very, very content with continuing on that narrative and just having the war progress at the rate that it was progressing. And so now that Russia appears to be turning up the dial significantly, they're probably saying to themselves, you know what? If this ends in 3 months, in 6 months, then what do we tell our people? What are we going to tell them when they're hungry, when they're cold?
Yeah, that's why I'm thinking.
No more money. Are we going to continue to say, well, it's Putin, it's Putin? They're going to say, you know what? That was 3 months ago. That's over. What are you guys doing now to fix these problems? They're going to have an answer. And that's what they're worried about.
Yeah,
Larry, go ahead, please.
What's lacking for the United States and NATO is the galvanizing event. Pearl Harbor was a galvanizing moment that transformed an isolationist public in the United States into one ready to go kick ass. The attacks on 9/11, the events surrounding 9/11 in the United States, again, transformative in terms of galvanizing public opinion to support military adventurism overseas. You don't have that here with Ukraine, even though the propaganda campaign by the West, by the intelligence agencies and the military organizations, have been intense in trying to promote that, but it's failing. Let's face it, Putin is not Saddam Hussein. He doesn't have golden toilets and this lavish expenditures on all sorts of luxuries, or whatever he does, he keeps it hidden and it's quiet. So, but yet they're desperate to make him the enemy, but it's not resonating. And so, as Alex was correctly noting, that as the economic reality comes home and people are hungry and cold and unemployed and stores are shuttering and businesses are shuttering. I mean, they're already closing down in Germany and in the UK and in France, that these politicians who have tried to beat the war drums, they're going to have to deal with the reality at home. I mean, look at what happened in Russia during World War I, back before there was a Soviet Union, when the domestic economic problems even there they weren't able to sustain the military effort, and despite some of their early advances early on in that war. So, people are lousy with history, and they learn no good lessons. So I think we're sort of going to learn. I'll call it the Tet Offensive. The United States people were being told that we were winning. America was winning in Vietnam. We're winning. Well, then comes the Tet Offensive. Now, it wasn't really a defeat for the United States in terms of military defeat. In fact, it was devastating for the Viet Cong. But it changed the entire emotional and psychological outlook that this was something the United States could not win. And that moment's coming, I think, for NATO and the United States here in the next 2 to 3 months.
Oh, you think that there's going to be some sort of Tet Offensive where all of a sudden the West realizes this is a lost cause and we have to cut our losses?
Yeah, I know. I think it'll be a combination of the forced surrender of a number of Ukrainian units in the field right now, and coupled with some major strikes on centers that up to this point, Russia, for whatever reason, has avoided hitting. But they have not taken out the command center in Kiev. They should, in my view. For whatever reason, they've held off on that. But I think now that they've said we're at war with the West, we're going to do that.
But Larry, precisely because the Russians, lots of flaws that they may have, but they're not stupid and they know how to conduct a war. Perhaps they haven't struck a command and control center in Kiev precisely because they want to avoid a galvanizing event, that sort of like sparks everybody in the West to really take up arms and create a big headache for the Russians. Because, I think that we would all agree, and if anybody disagrees, please say so, but we would all agree that even if NATO were to muster up their troops, Russia is going to win this. They've got a bigger army than all of the West and Ukraine combined, and they have certainly the desire. They recognize this as an existential threat, and they are totally politically unified. And so even if all of the West all of a sudden were to put troops on the ground, the Russians are going to win it. But lacking that galvanizing event, they might realize to themselves, hey, let's not hit a command and control center where a bunch of NATO people are located and running this war, really. And so let's hold back and keep on grinding. Do you think that that's their thinking?
No, I think the way that this is going to roll out is that once the referenda are in place, once the republics are incorporated, then in the ensuing attacks by Ukraine on the civilians in those territories, that will be crossing the red line. It will now be used by Russia as their full justification. We're going to stop this, and we're going to stop it at the source, and that will include, I think, attacks on NATO units, the supply
NATO units in Ukraine,
the supply routes, and possibly in Poland. I think
but that would be a galvanizing event, wouldn't it? I mean, in Poland being attacked,
they're going to say we're going to stop this influx of weapons that are killing our people. That's going to stop. Up to this point, it's been sort of curious that they keep getting these civilian casualties that are mounting in Donetsk in particular, but they've had it in Kherson. And so at some point, that Russia is going to feel that it has legal justification to push back on that.
Guys, I have to run. Thank you very much.
Any final thoughts before you run?
Larry, Brian, thank you.
Because we're all disappointed that you're going off to that other stream.
I'm waiting to
feel betrayed.
I'm curious to really see how NATO and how the EU and the US react to everything. I mean, there's a lot of focus on what Russia is doing, but I'm really curious to see what they're going to do.
Yeah, I think that we all are. And so go off.
I'm terrified to see what they're going to do, but
I am too, because
we're going to have to face it and see what they're going to do. Anyway,
Take it easy.
All right, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much for coming.
Take care, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Well, what I was going to say was that I think Russia has been very careful, and they have managed the way this has escalated over the last 7 months. I think they have plans in place on how to escalate it further. There's certain, I guess you would say, checkpoints that they have to reach, that NATO has to put the pressure on in a certain way for them to initiate the next form of escalation. I want to point out something that I have been thinking about this the entire time this conflict has been going on. Russian President Vladimir Putin wrote this essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And he was making the point about how Ukraine and Russia and Belarus, it's all part of one big family. Now, imagine if on the very first day, February 24th, Russia just steamrolled into Ukraine with 1 million troops. They were like vaporizing towns, knocked out the electric grid, the water grid, put a crater in Kiev where all the decisions were making. It would not really, from a very tactical point of view, maybe, that would expedite everything, but politically and strategically, maybe not. And maybe they thought we have to try to go in there, do it as a special military operation, offer them all of these off-ramps, negotiations, ceasefires, things like that. And we have to make it abundantly clear to absolutely everyone, not just the Russian population, but our allies across Eurasia, but also people in the West. Show that we tried. We tried to do this as a special military operation, and it's only because of Ukraine's belligerence and belligerence that NATO has been buttressing this entire time that we have to escalate this further. I think that's what we're watching here. I think they have a very calculated way they're going to continue escalating this. So, this is what I've been thinking all along. I don't think it was they thought they were going to do this in 3 days, and now they're panicking and they're doing this mobilization out of panic. I really don't see it that way.
No.
As a matter of fact, there are Western analysts who have been talking for months now about how Russia has been quietly preparing for mobilization. They have these networks. This is not something you do overnight. You have networks where you have to assess what you actually have available. You have to call people up and see where they are. Are these people still available? And they've been doing this for months and months. So this was not something that was prompted by Kharkov. It's just something that they have been thinking about. And I think they were just waiting for the right time to escalate towards this.
I think actually that it's the reverse order. I think that the Kharkov pullout by the Russians, I think that it was part of their plan for escalation at this point. And I think that the real thing that was dictating the Russians' timetable was the Samarkand meet, because they would be able to go face to face with India and China and the other regional powers, Turkey, and tell them, look, we're going to escalate now. And I think that retrospectively, it might prove that the so-called Kharkov offensive, which Alexander Mercouris very aptly called it punching air, I think it was that was going to happen anyway, that they were going to pull back to the river, to the Oslo River, I believe it's called, and sort of tidy up the territory that they held prior to Samarkand so that they could get, in essence, not quite the go-ahead from their allies, but at least no objection and a clear understanding of the Russians' motivation. You see what I'm saying? Larry, what do you think?
Well, I'm sitting here thinking that we've got a lot of assumptions built in that may not actually be correct. Let's go back to the Kharkov offensive. I think there's the assumption that the Russians were surprised, at least some in the West, that we succeeded in that. Yet the ability to surprise any nation with let's call it first world spy technology, from overhead satellites, from raw imagery from fixed wing aircraft as well, from signal intercepts, from intercepted communications, that the ability to hide the massing of force to carry out an offensive is, I think, almost impossible. So I go with the assumption that, in fact, the Russians knew this was coming, and they had to make a choice of whether are we going to insert enough forces to fight that. And we're looking at it again with this broader strategic picture of we're going to have this referendum coming down the line in Donetsk and Luhansk and Kherson and Zaporizhia. So therefore, we're going to pull back, solidify, and protect those areas. This is, I don't think this is being made up on the fly. I think Brian correctly noted there's planning involved with this, and the planning is not just two guys in a room jotting down a to-do list, but it's much more involved with that, and it gets out with having a variety of taskings of how many trucks are we going to need for this, how many people are we going to need for that, etc. If you go back to like World War II, when the Soviets planned the counteroffensive around the Battle of Stalingrad, they did surprise the Germans there. And part of that was the Germans did not have overhead imagery from satellites to tell them that these Russian forces were massing. And they didn't have good human intelligence telling them that, hey, all these guys are showing up. So as we look at that, we see also this push by Western intelligence to try to create as confused a picture as possible about what's going on with Russia. And I think their target audience to confuse are the people in the United States and Europe, not the Russians.
I completely agree.
One of the things that's on the Telegram channels, and I'd be interested in your guys' reactions, over the last 24 hours, I've seen two different memes. Meme one is all of these cars lined up at different border posts. Everybody's fleeing Russia because of the mobilization. They're in line at the airports. They're getting out on the airports. The planes are booked up. They can't get out. And then you see, they're accused forming outside military enlistment centers of men trying to join up. Now, it's diametrically opposed. And I've got to believe that's being generated by the West, at least the part about everybody fleeing Russia because of the mobilization, given the fact that they're mobilizing reservists, guys that have already been in the military, people who don't have to go through basic training. They already understand military organization, order, discipline, and etc. So they're not going to be looking at months and months of quote training to get them prepared to be able to contribute.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this notion that everybody's running away from Russia. And paradoxically, I was thinking about that. This for Putin is actually a political bonus, because the people who are fleeing are precisely the people who are pro-Western, i.e. anti-Putin/Kremlin, anti-SMO. So he's actually getting rid of the people who would not be necessarily a thorn in his side, but might potentially give a PR win to the West. Those are the people who are fleeing. The people who are hardcore in favor of this, i.e. the majority of the Russians, I think that rather their thinking is, finally you're escalating this thing, as opposed to shooting this war. I mean, fighting this war with kid gloves. Brian, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I was looking at that. I was just thinking, if I was the U.S. State Department, I would want to try to create the illusion that the Russian population was rising up against the mobilization. There's very specific constraints on who is going to be mobilized, and you see these people that are protesting. There's no way that they are eligible to be mobilized. So why are they out? Who are they protesting?
Who are they fooling?
Or against?
It's Larry's right. They're fooling the American public and the European public.
Yeah, and as someone who is in a country that is under constant attack by U.S.-sponsored protests, this is all they do. They have people who dedicate their lives as a full-time career to just create the illusion of dissatisfaction among the population, how to turn a protest that is like 100 people and make it look like it's 10,000 people. At the same time, you do actually see massive protests across Europe over the prices increasing, which is directly related to the West's support of Ukraine. And so people need to keep all of these things in mind, that there probably are going to be some people who feel uncomfortable about the mobilization in Russia. That's inevitable. But like the people who are queuing outside the to report for mobilization. When you look at those people, those look like people that you would want to send into a conflict. They look like the kind of people that have the competence to do that. And the people who are fleeing or protesting don't look like that. So I mean, it's very easy to see through what's going on. The West is obviously, they're not going to just let them mobilize and not try to complicate it. So that is what we're seeing.
Yeah, because the people fleeing are people who didn't like it anyway. And I follow a lot of YouTube channels that are filmed in Russia, but they are by English speakers. And you can see it's a segment of the population that just doesn't like Russia. In every country in the world, there's always a segment of the local population that just doesn't particularly care for it for reasons of their own, for individual reasons that are myriad. But they want to flee. And this gives them the opportunity to flee, the excuse to flee. And also, I think that some of them might be thinking to themselves that they'll find welcoming arms wheresoever they may happen to go, as being Russians who are against Putin and all that kind of stuff. And it's the typical human motivation. I mean, people are fundamentally simple. And if they don't like some place, they tend to leave. And if they have a good excuse to leave that assuages their feelings of guilt or homesickness or what have you, they'll take it. And I think that this is what's happening here. Larry?
Do you think that's what I'm trying to get the feel for? If some of these images that are popping up on Telegram are actually legitimate. What puzzled me, for example, was one of the first ones was, oh boy, the Russians are lined up at the Finnish border. They can't wait to get into Finland. And I'm thinking, last I checked, I've not seen the Finns wanting to carry Russians around on their shoulders and going, oh, well, welcome, you poor oppressed people. It's just like I'm very skeptical, having worked covert action myself against in Soviet Union and on the Afghan task force at CIA, where we were putting out videos and articles and trying to create memes around the world. And it was that was pre-social media days back then. We were buggy whips and horses back then. But now with the ability of what they can do, it's pretty. They can gin up images and try to create this theme that, oh boy, the Russian population is extremely unhappy with Putin, and I'm not really seeing that. No. And I think it is they're going to take upon any image of people that are lined up somewhere and then slap a label on it. See, these people are fleeing, when in fact they may have heard that they're selling discounted Nikes or something.
Yeah,
that's what they're doing.
Yeah, because I think it was one of the Western mainstream media was reporting in Kherson of this flow of traffic in both directions, from the Russian control zone to the Ukraine control zone, and most of the people were going to the Russian control zone. And just a few cars here and there were going to the Ukrainian zone, and it was very amusing. And of course, that didn't run for very long in the mainstream media, but that seems to be the actual case. But of course, they can't admit to that. I mean, it would defeat their entire narrative. To go back to the thing that I'm just so curious about, I suppose it's sort of like, I'm watching a soap opera and I want to know what the next episode is going to be. What is going to happen next? I mean, I suppose that in this chess game, we have to see what the West does, but I, honest to God, can't think of anything realistically that they could answer this partial mobilization with. I mean, I'm trying to think of anything.
Well, look at what's happening to the U.S. military across the board. They can't even meet recruiting goals.
Yeah, so with a $50,000 bonus, and they can't meet them.
They're closing down. They're shutting down, eliminating some ships from the Navy. Certain air wings, they don't have enough planes and/or pilots to keep this. So there's a contraction at the very time that you're pretending that you're going to take on Russia toe to toe. It's crazy.
So where do we go from here, Brian?
Well, I would just say that you see this mobilization. You see what Russia has accomplished with its special military operation. I continuously tell people that's not a euphemism for total war. That it really was a special military operation with self-imposed constraints that are now being removed. what just happened before this decision was made. There was this huge offensive that Ukraine openly prepared for months, admittedly used up a huge amount of the equipment the West has transferred to Ukraine. With all of these troops, they took heavy losses around Kherson. They accomplished almost nothing there. They took all of this territory around Kharkov, but they suffered huge losses there as well. And I compared it to the Ardennes offensive in right at the end of the war there, how it was an all or nothing gamble by Germany. They threw everything that they had into this last offensive and it failed. And then it left them even more vulnerable. It put them at the complete mercy of the Allies. Yeah. And I have been comparing this offensive that Ukraine has launched to that because it looks like an all or nothing offensive. And now they've gambled, they lost, and now they're facing this military that they really didn't dent with this offensive. And now 300,000 extra soldiers are coming in. That really looks like a repeat scenario. People said, well, Brian, that's because you're a Putin propagandist. That's why you're saying that. But there was this Austrian army colonel. Me too. There's this Austrian army colonel, Colonel Marcus Reisner. Yeah, he did a presentation about the Kherson and Kharkov offensives. And he himself, he did multiple historical comparisons of possible comparisons that would make sense. And what was one of his comparisons? The Ardennes offensive. He said the exact same thing. This might have been the presentation was even titled "All In," something like that. All in. It was a last.
When everybody agrees on more or less the accurate truth, they all tend to name it the same thing, and it's basically that. That's what they did. It was all in, and now, of course, there is this sense that the Russian army, reinforced, ready for bear, forgive the pun, they could go in and it seems to me that they are going to sweep the Donbass and the Zaporozhye region after this referendum, or the various referendums that are going to be taking place. And after that, I mean, one wonders what will remain of Ukraine. I mean, that's my thinking at this point. Just like what happened with the German military in 1945, after January, when the offensive petered out, it was 4 months, and they were in Berlin.
Yeah. Well, I actually sort of have I want to lay out, get Brian's opinion on something that with regards to the offensive. I posted, there was a interesting video that I picked up on Telegram, that it showed a group of Ukrainian, is roughly a company size, Ukrainian element. They're on armored personnel carrier, at least a couple platoon of that company. So they're attacking a fortified position of the Luhansk militia. Now, so the armored personnel carrier comes into the field, and then all these guys are jumping out and running out, and it looks like you had about 30 people attacking one guy, and the one guy is holding them off. And then as the video progresses, you start seeing Russian artillery coming in on this attacking company and killing them. So what struck me with this in terms of the Ukrainian offensive is I have seen no video evidence, and maybe Brian has, or if you have, Gonzalo, of the showing Ukrainian units attacking, let's call it blitzkrieg style, where there are tanks, armored personnel carriers, other vehicles moving forward with the troops moving behind them to support the armored attack, being supplemented with artillery that's shelling Russian fixed positions and being accompanied by fixed-wing aircraft that are attacking Russian positions. We've seen nothing like that at all. All we've seen are these guys, like even in this case, why the hell didn't that armored vehicle go forward with these guys behind it providing cover? Didn't do that. It's like, hey, guys, get off. I'm out of here. See you later. They acted like some sort of Uber driver. Okay, I've reached my destination. Give me a tip. See you later. I mean, Brian, have you seen anything about, let's call it an attack in operational depth?
But this is what they were trying to do in Kherson, and it was an absolute failure. They had aircraft, whatever remained of the Ukrainian Air Force was involved. They had all of their artillery, whatever they had. They had infantry going in, and that's what they were trying to do. But even the Western media admitted, well, you're going up against Russian defenses in depth. They've got their multiple lines, and then they have their security zone. And they were dealing with all of this as it was coming in. They admit that Russia outguns Ukraine in terms of artillery, in terms of the number of artillery, the amount of ammunition available, and they outrange Ukrainian forces. Okay, they have HIMARS, M270s. Russia has the equivalent, but just in many more numbers. So we were trying to attack a line like this, even if you're using combined arms warfare, you're going to be overwhelmed by who you're attacking. The disposition of forces that doesn't make any sense. The only place where they were successful was around Kharkov. And again, even Western analysts admitted Russian forces weren't even there. They had a very tiny amount of forces. As soon as it began, they made the decision to cross the Oskol River, create a defensive line there. Everyone was to fall back behind this line. So the success that Ukraine had was because there were no Russian forces there. Where there are Russian forces, they are completely overwhelmed and destroyed. So what does that tell you about the future now going into this with the referendums and with 300,000 Russian forces coming into the mix? What does that tell you is going to happen with whatever is left of the Ukrainian military? And, either Gonzalo or Larry, maybe you could help answer this question. I keep having people tell me, no, Brian, it's possible for a military to actually get bigger and stronger over the course of a conflict. And Ukraine is like the United States during World War II. They've got the West backing them, and Russia cannot attack, the training centers in the West and the weapon shipments coming in, which to a certain degree is true, but the West just doesn't have the capacity or the weapon systems that are compatible with what Ukraine can actually use. They don't have enough of that to make that an actual viable scenario. But maybe I'm wrong, so I pose that question back.
Where could new Ukrainian recruits train without being subject to rocket missile attacks by Russia? There is no safe place in Western Ukraine. And Russia made that very clear early on with I think it was the March 13th attack at Yavoriv, where they decimated one of these mercenaries. Yavoriv was in fact a de facto NATO base at the time and had been used extensively for NATO training in the previous years. So Russia's already sent that message. There is, as Brian noted, if you're going to bring new people into a military organization, the entire, the basic training itself is about a 2-month process, 2 to 3 month process. And then after that, the individual training that takes place, the advanced individual training, that's another couple of months. So at a minimum, you're looking 6 to 8 months before you'd even have people that were going to be marginally capable of contributing anything on the ground. Well, while that 6 month training is going on, you've got this conflict continuing, and Russia's not sitting back letting Ukraine just idly build up its resources. And by the same token, Ukraine, even with NATO support, has shown no ability to actually sustain an attack on Russian supply depots, Russian training locations, Russian troop formations, and the militias of the Donbass. They haven't. So it's like, so where is this military defeat going to come from? I don't get it.
Yeah, I don't see how they can win either. I mean, my thinking has always been, that you fight with the army that you got at that particular moment. The notion that you might add on to it, this is not World War II. There is no safe place in Ukraine, certainly. And I remember very clearly that Yavoriv strike, that retrospectively, I tend to view it as that was a staging area for incoming NATO troops. That's always been my thought. And that those volunteers that were there, mercenaries, private military contractors, whatever they were specifically, there were over 400 killed. And I think that was sort of like the tip of the NATO spear that got obliterated. I always think more of not the men killed, but rather the amount of gear that was destroyed. It was accounted at something like $400 million worth of gear that was at Yavoriv. That was just, annihilated. And I think that was the moment when NATO made up its mind collectively that they weren't going to go in boots on the ground. But insofar as building up an army, they are losing troops faster than they could possibly train them, even if they could train them. So I don't see a possibility of any kind of Ukrainian military victory at this time. The Zelensky regime just doesn't have the forces. And by the way, have you guys noticed that it's coming out in the mainstream media that that what we all knew, of course, which was in the negotiations in March and very, very early April with the talks in Istanbul. In principle, the Zelensky regime and the Russians had sort of like come to some sort of semi-agreement, and it really was scotched by Boris Johnson and the West. And that's finally coming out. What is it now? 5 months, 5.5 months, almost 6 months after the fact. Yeah. I mean, this all could have been avoided, and there were multiple opportunities for the Zelensky regime to avoid this fate. But I think that now, especially with this partial mobilization, the Russians politically, the Kremlin politically, cannot stop until there's total victory. I think that this is a total victory, meaning the complete capture of all the territory of Ukraine. I think that this is the real significance of this partial mobilization. Would you guys agree with it? Do you think that for the Russians, they simply can't back out and they have to go all the way to the Polish border?
Just one moment. I gotta take an intermission. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I don't think so, because Russia doesn't want the headache that's going to come from having to try to quell hostile population.
Yeah.
Once you get west of the Dnieper, then you start encountering these very anti-Russian Ukrainians, which the animosity on this goes back well over 100 years.
Yeah.
So I don't see Russia wanting to bite that off. But what they can do is isolate and surround. I think you're correct that they're going to go across, continue west, just north of Odessa. They will isolate Odessa, ultimately take Odessa. They will go into the Transnistria and Moldova, and they'll control that entire swath of southern what's now Ukraine. Ukraine as we know it will cease to exist.
Oh yeah,
and it's not. But I think you're correct that it will be a total defeat from the standpoint that Ukraine. What's Ukraine going to fight back with? They don't have the wherewithal to produce their own equipment to fight the war. They don't have the wherewithal to produce their own weapons, ammunition. Just in contrast, again, to draw the historical parallel, that when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, the Soviets quickly dismantled factories, entire factories, put them on trucks, put them on trains, shipped them back to the east of the Ural Mountains, and then rebuilt them. And they did this in a period of about 6 months to a year that they were back up and operating and producing. So even though the Soviets were suffering devastating losses on the Eastern Front at the hands of the Nazis, they still had a manufacturing capability that the Nazis couldn't touch, couldn't destroy, couldn't attack. And they also had training facilities where new recruits could be brought and trained. And therefore, those new recruits were being, that was flowing into the Soviet army at the time. Well, Ukraine doesn't have anything comparable to that at all. They don't have a safe area. They're entirely dependent upon Europe. And we're already seeing the fissures develop within the European unity. I think just today the Austrian foreign minister came out with respect to trying to impose more gas sanctions on Russia and said, basically, hell no, we're not doing that. So much for consensus.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I wanted to bring up, and it slipped my mind because I wanted to bring up with when Brian was back. Hang on, talk amongst yourselves while I remember from my Alzheimer's days.
I'll just throw in that I don't know if you talked about this or not, but you heard the largest training program that I've heard so far was the UK. I think they said they're going to train 10,000 Ukrainian troops every 4 months. And yeah, it's a drop. I mean, it doesn't even come close to replacing what they're losing, even according to Ukraine's own numbers. Yeah. And then on top of that, it turns out that they weren't training 10,000 troops for 4 months. They were bringing in numbers of troops that were giving them abbreviated training and then sending them back. It was just a couple of weeks. And then over the course of those 4 months, they would process 10,000. This is even worse. That's even worse than if you were just training 10,000. At least you were training them properly and sending them back. It's unsustainable. So people continuously talk about the strategic depth Ukraine enjoys because NATO is backing them. But it just as Larry, I caught the end of it, was talking about the Soviet Union strategic depth. That was something that Germany couldn't touch, and it was massive. It was only paralleled by the United States. Its industrial capacity. They just had thousands and thousands of tanks and everything that you could imagine. They were just shipping it. And people say that, well, German tanks were better. They were just fewer in number. The T-34 was not, if you look at the details of it, it's not, they got like very sufficient, significant, I should say, welding issues and everything, but it was still a formidable platform. And it accomplished its task.
That's something that I always find extremely funny. And you both know a lot more about weaponry than I ever will. But they keep saying that the Western weapons are so much better than the Russian weapons. But I always think to myself, well, they're a lot more sophisticated, requiring a hell of a lot more maintenance and support. And so sometimes, good enough is much better than top of the line. I mean, really, like an AK-47. Yes, a simple weapon, and it's 70 years old, but it gets the job done. And whereas the new firearms are so sophisticated that you shoot twice and you need to get it repaired, sent to the shop or something. Yeah. I'm exaggerating, of course, but you know what I mean. A lot of these this equipment, it's better, quote unquote, but it doesn't last. Even the Ukrainian Undersecretary of Defense in charge of logistics at one point said so, and they shut him up because he was saying the part that you don't say out loud. That he was complaining about the M777s, that they only lasted one go around before needing to be shipped to Poland of all places. And I'm like, if the weapon doesn't shoot all the time, then what's the point of having the sophisticated gear?
Well, the point I think a lot of people don't appreciate is that weapon design in the United States, what is in the arsenal of both the Army, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the Navy, that it's dictated not by a strategic plan, not by tactical requirements. It's more influenced by the politics of where's the plant going to be built and which contractors are going to get the money for it. So oftentimes you get weapon systems that are very, very costly and not very practical from being used on a battlefield. If you go back to World War II as an example, the T-34 tank was a superior tank to the Sherman tank, period. I mean, it didn't catch fire as easily. It was, a whole variety of advantages. But when you take that period, 1942 to 1945, the reality is Russia built more tanks than the United States did in that same period. So again, we've got this myth that the United States was such an industrial powerhouse and Russia, the Soviets were sucking air and they could barely, organize a horse parade. That just wasn't true. But
Larry, something that I've noticed is that, see, there's nothing wrong with having pride in having fought and won a war. There's nothing wrong with that. But what's happened in the United States, and perhaps it's because of pop culture or whatever, is this notion that the United States on its own won the Second World War, and the Russians were these buffoon incompetents that played no role whatsoever in the defeat of the Germans in the Second World War, and therefore it translates to a current mentality that the Russians can't shoot straight, that the Russians are just all in all incompetent, which I find very, very dangerous, because I mean, Sun Tzu said very well, if you don't know your enemy, you're going to lose every battle. Well, it was longer than that, but you know what I mean. They do not seem to understand first of all, the quality of the political leadership of Russia. I mean, they really are on the ball. They know what they're doing. And insofar as the Russian armed forces are concerned, they have this bizarre notion that they just are garbage at everything. And that gives them a false sense of security that will lead them off the cliff. That's my great concern about this kind of nonsense talk.
Yeah, no, I agree. It is the failure to understand and have any appreciation
Respect for.
Yeah, the respect for, I think, is I was in Kiev back in 1994. My job at the time, I was a bodyguard for a CIA contractor, a female. So I was to protect her from the lecherous advances of a guy named Vyacheslav. We called him Vyech the Lech. But it was there where I first came to the realization that a lot of what I had been told by intelligence about the capabilities of the Soviets, the Russians and Ukrainians, it was a complete disconnect. And you began to get an appreciation for some of the suffering, the economic suffering that was taking place back then. But now we fail to appreciate that the advances Russia has made militarily, because we're still imagining that we drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan by backing the Mujahideen back in 1988. And so, by God, that's the same Russian army that exists today, and it's not.
I want to add to what Larry's been saying, because he's been making a lot of really good points about the military-industrial complex that you will find in the United States. Oh, and
I'm still here. It's just annoying. Don't worry.
Yeah. Okay. Be safe.
Air raid.
Yeah, just another normal day. So you had the military-industrial complex in the United States, and every nation, Russia, China, they all have their own complexes. And you're absolutely right. These are political projects. It's about when you look at how a tank is made, they're making it on one half of the country, shipping it to a factory on the other side, and it's purely for political reasons. It has nothing to do with efficiency. It's about maximizing profit, maximizing political benefit, and it makes an industrial complex deficient. It does. You were talking about the space program, the U.S. space program, the Russian space program. United Launch Alliance was literally buying Russian rocket engines to put on their rockets, and it was also extremely dysfunctional. The United States depended on Russia to send their astronauts to the International Space Station. Because why? Because the aerospace industry, which is linked to the military-industrial complex, was doing the exact same thing, to the point where they have this monopoly. They're maximizing profits. They are not driven by any sort of purpose beyond maximizing profit, which is what leads to a country like the United States with the capability to do it themselves ending up depending on Russia. Russia is very practical. They're driven by purpose. Their military-industrial complex, their aerospace industry, it may not be pretty, but it serves its purpose. And they have demonstrated this over and over again, from World War II all the way to present day. And I think it's another good point talking about the Russian military during their time in Afghanistan, and the military today is not the same. Even the Russian military from the first Chechen War to the second Chechen War was not the same. This is something that Russia historically has done. They will blunder, but they will learn from their mistakes, and they will improve upon it, and they will stubbornly, persistently figure it out till they get it right. They have done this over and over again throughout history. There's no reason to think that this is the first exception to that pattern.
Yeah, the concept of lessons learned. I was involved for 23 years with the scripting and execution of counterterrorism exercises for U.S. military special operations forces. And these are always done in conjunction with the theater commands, with it used to be called PACOM. It's now got a whole new acronym because they incorporate India in it, or European Command, EUCOM, Africa Command, AFRICOM, Southcom, Southern Command for Latin America. And so when you, at the end of these exercises, there'd always be what they'd call a hot wash. And the hot wash would be where you go through about what did we learn from this? What did we do wrong? What did we do great? And it was always the same, where, yeah, man, this was the best exercise ever. We did this magnificently. And nobody ever learned a damn thing. When I started that whole process, I assumed that it would be like a set of stairs going up. That each, you'd learn from your predecessor. You'd take that knowledge and you'd build on it. And there would be, that doesn't happen in the U.S. military. It's almost like an Alzheimer's convention. They forget whatever had happened before. There is no retention, no lesson learned. I mean, a simple example. In Vietnam, when they would send out a patrol, a long-range patrol, at least those, or there would be some sort of movement in force. There would be a quick reaction force back behind, but the quick reaction force consisted of at least a company, 150 men with the helicopters to get them to the scene, coupled with artillery that would be zeroed in on the positions that they were going to be occupying, and with backup fixed-wing aircraft. In other words, that when that force got out there and got into trouble, by God, there would be artillery, there would be airplanes, and there would be some reinforcements coming in. Up ahead of Afghanistan. What's our reaction force in Afghanistan? Remember, the 4 SEALs got down. Ultimately, all were killed but one, and he was ultimately later released by the Taliban. There was a 17-man helicopter force that came in, and when those guys were getting hit, there was no artillery because we didn't let it. In other words, none of the lessons that were learned in Vietnam were ever applied in Afghanistan. We recreated a new being, a new thing. So that failure to learn and is I think the Achilles heel of the U.S. military right now.
And to kind of link that to what's going on right now. If you look at the U.S. military, it is still configured around fighting small wars. Them sending the M777. I mean, the reason they developed the M777 to replace the M198 was because it was light. It could be moved around. It was perfect for what was going on in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. That is inappropriate to put into a situation like in Ukraine, and the entire U.S. military is configured that way. And so they're constantly preparing to fight the last war that they fought. And even U.S. military planners will admit this is a habitual problem the U.S. military establishment has. When I went to basic training in 2000, we were still they were still talking about Vietnam and stuff. And they're constantly doing that, where they're fighting they're getting ready to fight the last war they were in instead of getting ready to fight the next war. This is what Russia had been doing since, since they got tangled up with Georgia, and they realized, hey, we have to revamp our entire military. We have to get ready for this. And their military industrial complex driven by purpose. It's not to say that there aren't profits and corruption involved. There is, but just to a lesser extent than the United States. The U.S., when you're a corporation maximizing profits, you already have this system. You're going to try to convince planners that this system can do everything, including fight the next war, because we don't want to, research and development, that takes a chunk out of our bottom line. So if we could avoid doing that, let's avoid doing that. This is, I mean, like from my personal look at it, it seems to be that is the problem. And that is biting them seriously in this conflict right now that they're trying to fight through Ukraine.
What I find interesting is that there is no longer the conception that the military-industrial complex is corrupted. They view it as the corruption has been normalized. I mean, it is insane to have a weapon system where different parts of it are manufactured in every single congressional district in the country, which is what is going on with the F-35, I believe, right?
and nobody looks at this and realizes this is corrupt. Everybody's like, oh no, that's the way of doing business. The normalization of corruption, an inability to see that the function of a military has been corrupted by the politicking and the money making, especially, and the way that the money is recycled into these congressional critters and all the rest of it, and the military industrial complex. They have no conception of it. And so the American military is completely corrupt. And and the problem also too is that the United States is a bit of a victim of its own success in an imperial manner, because since it is an empire, it's never had to go up against somebody on an equal footing. It's always these little wars with these untrained people, and these poor people get slaughtered by this massive, inefficient, completely corrupt military, whereas the Russians, for whatever reasons or whatever political mechanisms they had in place to sort of like straighten up and fly right, if you will, their military industrial complex is subservient to the military purpose of the armed force. It's not an end in itself, whereas the American military is an end in itself. It's just this expensive boondoggle, and I think that at some fundamental level, the American military leadership must recognize this. I mean that's the reason I think that they have been so leery of engaging and going in boots on the ground. They realize that, bottom line, they're like this prize fighter that's gone up against these midgets, these amateurs, these people who don't know how to fight, and all of a sudden they're looking at Mike Tyson and they're like, "No, sir, I want no part of that." I mean, yeah. You see what I'm saying?
Well, you know, what people I think fail to appreciate is how more complicated the production, distribution, and lobbying system has become. So let's recognize, going back to the Civil War, there were manufacturers in the North that managed to get wealthy off of that war because they were producing items that the government was buying. We saw the same thing in World War I. We saw the same in World War II. What has happened now is the transformation of the politics. I saw this firsthand because I lived in Bethesda, Maryland, where I lived. My next door neighbor is the largest lobbyist in Washington, D.C. And we were friends and we talked. But what has happened is, if you're going to run for Congress or if you're going to run for Senate, you're going to need money. And it is not a matter of going out and talking to the voters. You spend an amount of time, particularly for new candidates, of having to raise money, call people up. Well, that's where this lobbyist comes in, because the lobbyist will come and hold a fundraiser, and usually kicking money because the money's coming from, my friend represented General Dynamics, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, all the biggies. And they pour that money in. So a lot of his time is spent raising money for all these members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, so that they'll have money that when it comes time for their campaign to fund it. And in the process, they also make some money off of it on the side. That's one of the reasons Liz Cheney went from having a net worth of $7 million to $40 million in a 7-year period in Congress.
I thought she was as good at picking stock.
She's a frugal lady. So, here you have this system of the money that is at the core of it. And then, as you correctly noted, the way they ensure that you get support for any particular weapons program is you make sure that every congressional district has a piece of the pie, because they've got workers who are going to benefit from it. So they'll vote for it, regardless of whether it makes any sense from a military standpoint. Then internally within these military services, what's going on is talk about the good old boys network. They keep creating new commands, new units, new structures, so that they'll have a place where all these general officers can have a job. If you go back and look at World War II, on average, there was one officer for every 10 enlisted guys in the Navy. Today, that number is like 1.5, and we've got fewer. Think about we've got probably 2/3 fewer ships than we had in World War II. And yet we have a larger naval officer corps today than we had in World War II. So it corrupts the institution because you're putting people in make work jobs. It's basically, a friend of mine called it welfare for white guys. So.
No, I want to be winding down this conversation because we've been going on for almost 2 hours, and I don't want to overstay the welcome and overstay your kind. You both of you kindly joining in this broadcast, because I want to go back to the issue at hand, which is this escalation, and frankly, the reaction of the West, which I think is the key issue. And my great fear, is that these people are right now so panicking because, like you said, Brian, when they say that Putin is panicking, no, it's all projection. I mean, whatever kind of subjective qualification they ascribe to the Russians, it's what they themselves are feeling and projecting onto them. And this happens consistently across the board, and we've seen it countless times. And so my fear is that the panic in the Biden administration of them wondering what's going to happen, because they know the numbers. They know the numbers that the Zelensky regime forces. My thinking at this time is that after these catastrophic offensives that cost them so many men, needlessly, because they accomplished nothing as a practical matter, that they really are at the end of their tether, like the Germans at the end of January of 45. And so this would be the perfect opportunity with this, bulked up Russian army to really just sweep in and just take over. I mean, really astonishing setbacks might be in the cards in the next few weeks, certainly by the end of the year. And so my concern is that in their panic, the Western leadership will do something that can't be taken back, a step so far that they go all in. As we've been saying, that the Zelensky regime went all in on this offensive and they lost. It could be that the Western backers also go all in with some measure or other. And that's my great concern. I just can't imagine at this time what that all-in measure might be. I'll throw it to you, Brian. What do you think is going to be their all-in? They're like, we're going to win this no matter what.
Well, I think what we were just talking about before reaching this point was the fact that the whole reason the U.S. and the nations that it has dragged along for this agenda, the whole reason they want to do this is to feed their short-sighted greed. And their short-sighted greed is precisely why they're not succeeding right now. Yeah. They are going up against people who realize this is existential. They have arrayed their society to face it, and the West hasn't. So what could they do? I really don't know. I mean, there are no good options at all. They tend to prefer to spend other people's money and blood rather than their own. I don't know how far they would be willing to go to put themselves at risk. I think we're watching it max out. I would say like probably something like a buffer zone, like they tried to do in Syria. This is something that they've done before that I think maybe they feel comfortable trying again, and then trying to build.
Grabbing a piece of Ukraine, of Western Ukraine, to hold it as a buffer zone. Perhaps something like the Poles have been talking about Western Ukraine, using the Poles as the excuse to take a piece out of Ukraine.
Yeah, they might even play it even safer by just kind of putting Poland out there on their own and being like, look, you can go and do it. We're not doing Article 5. Just get as much done as you can. That's one possibility. Alex, before he left, was talking about opening up a second front. We can see that they're clearly trying to do that. But we have to remember that if they go all in here.
By the way, just to recap, it's Armenia, Azerbaijan. You did a really brilliant video that I suggest everybody go check out on that conflict. You did it like 2-3 days ago. I forget, but it was really good, where you just really dissected it. Kudos, man. That was good. Where else? There's also like Kazakhstan. There's been noise coming out of Kazakhstan, of all places. I mean,
before and after. Because remember, they tried to do that color revolution before Russia went into Ukraine, and Russia actually went into Kazakhstan to quell it, and now they're trying it again. So they're definitely going to tried to do that. But one last thing that maybe I would like to end on is no matter what they do in regards to Russia, they still have China. They're sitting there waiting, knowing full well that they're next, knowing full well what is really going on. They themselves have been biding their time and carefully preparing themselves. They have a huge military-industrial complex driven by the purpose of never being colonized again. So no matter how much success they have with Russia, then they have to do it all over again with a country that has 5 times the population as the U.S. Actually has a population bigger than the G7 combined. So that's something to consider.
Yeah. And Larry, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the apparent strategy is to try to create these sideshows to distract Russia in our Armenia, Azerbaijan, in the Balkans, even in Kazakhstan if possible. But I don't see that succeeding. And when all of that is accomplished, it does not change the strategic picture on the ground in Ukraine. That Russia has a decided advantage. Russia is going to continue to chew up and destroy and dismantle Ukrainian troops. I would have a different point of view if we were seeing Ukraine inflicting those level of casualties upon Russians or the Russian allies, but we're not seeing that. And in order for them to do that, they're going to have to field personnel or weapon systems capable of doing that. I'm not really aware of any particular weapon system that the United States could introduce into Ukraine that would be a quote game changer. We went through that with Scott Ritter on the 777s. That's a game changer, or the HIMARS a game changer. Well, it didn't change a damn thing in terms of the strategic picture. It just meant that it was drawing the United States in as having to, like a drug pusher. It's got its client more hooked, and so it's going to keep supplying what they need, but it's not going to change anything vis-a-vis the Russian position. So I really think the dominant player in this would be, as some have referred to it, as General Winter. As General Winter shows up and the fracturing in Europe accelerates, because you're not going to have this unified front anymore. It's going to be every man, woman, and child for themselves, so to speak, as they try to figure out how to survive and how to keep their economies intact. I mean, they're literally facing the shutdown, the deindustrialization of Europe. And that is profound, and most people really aren't even grasping that yet. So I think, again, Russia's military is structured for defending the motherland, defending the nation. Their military is not structured for foreign military adventures. That's not what they do. They don't have aircraft carrier groups, task force, to go out and project force around the world, because anymore having those is a useless gesture given with the advent of hypersonic missiles. They're big fat targets that can't be defended. Keeping Marine expeditionary forces and ships at sea so you can deploy the Marine Corps to enter particular territory to establish a U.S. presence. The Russians aren't doing that and haven't done that. That's not how they're set up. They've always been set up, if they're going to move troops into adjacent areas on their territory because they're going to protect their land. And the United States and NATO have no credible means or resources to affect that, to challenge that, to defeat that.
Well said. Well said. And so with that, I'm going to draw this stream to a conclusion. Gentlemen, it's been a real pleasure. Larry Johnson, you can find him at sonar21.com. It's in the link is in the description below. Brian Berletic at the New Atlas channel on YouTube. You can find his channel down in the description below. I want to thank you both, gentlemen, for having come on. And it was quite short notice, and I so appreciate that. And also Alex Christoforou, who went and betrayed us for that other stream that he was doing. I suggest you go check it out on the Duran. Alex and Alexander are just, top of the line, and it's been a real pleasure. And so, chat, I hope you enjoyed the show, and I will see you this Sunday, where I'm going to be having James Lindsay and a couple of other guests. We're going to be discussing the whole wokeness thing in American youth culture, most especially, because I'm bringing on a couple of younger people, Caitlin Bennett, and the name of the kid slips my mind, but you'll see it on Sunday. It's going to be a really good show. So looking forward to it. And so take it easy, chat.